Greetings, sisters and brothers, comrades. Welcome to African History Club, episode number 46. I'm your host, Milton Alimadi. There's been some lag time between episode number 45 and number 46. Prior to today's episode, I'd been focusing on contemporary issues, some of the ongoing coups in several African countries, and trying to put them in context, and also did an episode on the raging war in Ethiopia, which continues to escalate. So, as I was focusing on those contemporary issues, it diverted from the research into historical issues. So, today I would like to return to the historical issues. I have had some time between the last episode and today to research and read up on one of my South African heroes, Chris Hani. Many of you know Chris Hani was a great revolutionary, Pan African nationalist freedom fighter. He was a leader in the African National Congress, the ANC, and also a leader in the South African Communist Party, the SACP. Chris Hani was a great associate and compatriot of Joe Slovo. Joe Slovo, of course, as many of you also know, was a European South African whose family was originally Lithuanian and eventually migrated to South Africa. He was unique in the sense that he was the only European who had a leadership position in the armed wing of the ANC, which was Umkhonto Wesizwe, or Spear of the Nation, also referred to as MK occasionally. So they were great compatriots, and they actually were the leading military strategist for the ANC, MK, and they were also great political associates. They were both members and leaders of the South African Communist Party, in addition to having leadership roles in the African National Congress. They believed in a two-stage strategy to achieve a socialist society in South Africa. They believed in the first phase, they would need national revolutionary democracy, which would displace the South African apartheid regime and then would lay the groundwork for a socialist South Africa. So, as I said, Joe Slovo's life was ended very, very prematurely. He was only age 51 when he was assassinated in 1993. Ironically, just basically a few months before the democratic elections of 1994 that saw the election of Nelson Mandela as the first African president of South Africa. And even way before the election, Chris Hani had already indicated that he was not interested in a ministerial position or being in the cabinet because very similar to Steve Biko. Steve Biko, of course, was murdered by the apartheid regime much, much earlier in 1977. Both of them really believed that to transform South Africa, they would have to go beyond just replacing Europeans with Africans and basically maintaining the same system intact, the apartheid system, which is a form of a monstrous form of capitalism. Yes, it was racist. Yes, it was based on racial separation, racial exploitation, and humiliation. But at the end of the day, it was a form of capitalism. It was to maximize profits. So the racism was a factor in the production system, as Walter Rodney pointed out when he used the example of race relations in Guyana, manufactured hate and racism to maintain the separation of African and Indian Guyanese by the British ruling class. And that lecture is on YouTube, and it's called Race and Class in Guyanese Politics. And South Africa, pretty much the same thing. Keep the marginalized peoples fighting and separated, and of course, with the Europeans dominating all the other so called races in South Africa. That's what apartheid was really all about. So, Hani was killed by Europeans who wanted to spark a so called race war between whites and between Africans in order to derail negotiations that were already ongoing between the ANC and the Africana White National Party that dominated power, particularly since 1948, when apartheid became the official policy of South Africa. And it actually could have succeeded. The whites still dominated the armed forces command, and many of the white civilians were also very heavily armed. And they were hoping to provoke maybe a white led coup d'etat. And they believed that since they dominated the military, they would be able to hold power, pretty much similar to what Ian Smith did in what was then Rhodesia when he declared unilateral declaration of independence and maintained an apartheid system that lasted from 1965 all the way to 1980 because it was supported by Britain, the United States, and other European countries. So I think the white right wing elements in South Africa thought they might be able to pull off a similar situation. So it took the powerful intervention from the South African ANC leadership that knew that it would be catastrophic if those negotiations were to fail. So they made it a priority to convince the majority population, the Africans, that even though we lost a tremendous fighter and a very popular son of the soil, he was so popular that when the ANC had its first post-apartheid election for the National Executive Council in 1991, he got the most votes, 95% of the votes, followed closely by Thabo Mbeki, who came in second. And Mbeki, as many of you know, was the second African president of South Africa after Nelson Mandela served his one term and retired from politics. So that's how popular Chris Hani was. So there was a fear that his assassination could have indeed provoked so called racial upheaval in South Africa. I want to read briefly part of what Mandela said when Hani was assassinated. A white man full of prejudice and hate came to our country and committed a deed so foul that our whole nation teeters on the brink of disaster. A white woman of Afrikaans origin risked her life so that we may know and bring to justice his assassin. So basically, he was saying, yes, he was murdered by a racist European, Janos Wallos, but that an Afrikaner woman, and Afrikaners are the descendants of the Dutch in South Africa, who made up the bulk of the National Party, the Nationalist Party, the apartheid party in South Africa. So Mandela was trying to put things in some perspective and content and context, that not all whites in South Africa were hoping to provoke the so-called race war. So somehow South Africa managed to contain the backlash and the reaction that followed the murder of Chris Hani. And by the way, Janos and the person who supplied him with the gun, Clive Derby Lewis, both were tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. But then South Africa um, abolished capital punishment, and they were subsequently, their terms were changed to life in prison. And as far as I recall, they're both still serving their sentences. I also want to read what Joe Slovo, one of Chris Hani's closest friends and compatriots, said. Quote, Chris Hani had a dream of democracy. They killed the man, but they can never kill the dream. And the dream of Chris Hani is about to become a reality. So Chris Hani had actually succeeded Joe Slovo as the Secretary General of the South African Communist Party. He had also succeeded him at one point as the Chief of Staff of Umkhonto weSizwe, the MK, the armed wing of the ANC. Joe Slovo himself did not live much longer. After the death of Hani, he became a minister, I believe he was Minister of Housing, under Mandela's first government in 1994. But he died from cancer the following year. And he's buried in Soweto, which is, of course, the Mecca of black resistance to apartheid in African Township in South Africa, which is very unusual for a European. But Joe Slovo was an unusual European in every sense of the word unusual. So let's dig back a little at the life and times of Chris Hani. Go back into the past, even though I started with the conclusion, his unfortunate assassination. He was born in 1942 in the Xhosa speaking part of South Africa. And at the time, those areas the non-urban areas were basically reservoirs for cheap labor for the European South African industry, the mining industry in particular, and also the large commercial farms. In the case of the mines, the young men would leave their families and live in hostels close to the mines and remit funds to their families. It's pretty much like migrant workers within their own country, because their movement was supervised and controlled by the European security establishment. They had to carry the hated passbooks, internal type of passport, which led to the uprising later on of young South Africans in 1960 and the Sharpeville massacre. So Hani was born into, both his parents were Christians, they were Catholic, but they were non practicing Catholics. But Hani himself became quite religious, actually. He was a choir boy and had actually hoped to go into the seminary. But his parents um, rejected that notion for different reasons. His mother wanted him to bear grandchildren, to have grandchildren for him. Um, and his father believed that human beings should seek the good life right here on earth rather than waiting for the afterlife. So eventually, they persuaded him not to take that route. He was a very exceptionally bright young student. He liked to read a lot, and at one point, he joined an organization called the Non European Unity Movement. And that allowed him to start reading, and he's a teenager now, start reading radical literature. Thabo Mbeki was also a member of that group. Mbeki, of course, as I said, was the second president after Mandela. And some of the publications and journals produced by that group, one was called New Age, and the other one was called Fighting Talk. Fighting Talk was edited by Ruth First, also a revolutionary in her own right, also a member of the South African Communist Party. And she was the wife of Joe Slovo. She was later assassinated by South African intelligence, sent her a parcel bomb. At that time, she was living in exile in Mozambique. So she was assassinated in 1982. So I started getting exposed to literature, radical literature, and he also joined a socialist study group and got to read the Communist Manifesto. And he became involved with the organization. Yeah, and the other major influence on his politics were actually his father Gilbert Hani, and his uncle, who was my namesake actually, Milton Hani. Milton Hani was a member of the South African Communist Party. He was an organizer and activist in the cities in Cape Town, including organizing the literally, essentially, migrant workers, the African workers who came from the rural areas to work in the mines in the cities. And that's where Chris Hani really started absorbing his politics. His father was also an activist and a big critic of the Bantustan system that South Africa was created, so-called homelands in the rural areas where they created these fake semi autonomous uh, regions governed by Africans who essentially were mostly puppets of the regime. And they said this fulfilled their policy of apartheid, separateness, that let the Africans govern themselves in their own homelands, homelands that were totally bereft of all the resources, because obviously the resources were mined by the European dominated companies, and the labor was made up of the Africans, the African males, who had no choice but to work in the mines because that was the only recourse available to them. So his father was a critic of that system, including the black leaders at that time. At one point was Kaiser Mantanzima. So his father ended up being exiled um, to Botswana and then later to Lesotho, where Chris Hani also joined him much later. Chris Hani went to Fort Hare University, which was the only establishment that gave degrees to Africans at the time. Um, and he studied English and Latin. Chris Hani, throughout his life, he said he found no contradiction between his um, devout religiosity. He said, in fact, it was because of his commitment to his faith, and that is what really pulled him toward always wanting to fight for the oppressed and the exploited. And that naturally led him also to his um, embracing, becoming a Marxist Leninist. So he saw no contradiction, even though many purists would argue otherwise and take an opposite position. But it worked quite effectively for him. And he said the other influence was his the classics, the literature that he read, the Odyssey, the Iliad. He said in all the readings that he did, he would look at, um, read everything and try to relate it to contemporary issues, apply it to contemporary conditions. And that he found that was a very effective way in which all these um, dead writers from the past could actually influence contemporary conditions. So at the time he's now finishing university in 1961, this is the year after the Sharpeville massacre, when the police in South Africa killed, the estimates vary from 69 to more than 100, and more than 250 wounded, unarmed demonstrators who were demonstrating against the past laws. They hated internal passports, and the police opened live fire and just killed several dozens, particularly young people. And of course, many of you have seen some of the iconic photographs from that massacre. The young, of course, were always at the forefront of the resistance in South Africa. We also had the Soweto massacre in the following decades in 1976. So Chris Hani is coming of age at that unique point in the tumultuous history of apartheid South Africa. The regime had banned the South African Communist Party in 1950, so it had gone underground. The regime, after Sharpeville, banned the ANC, banned the PAC, the Pan Africanist Congress, and many other liberation organizations. And of course, in 1962, Mandela was arrested. By that time, the ANC, which had for decades pursued nonviolent resistance to fight the system, had also created the Umkhonto we Sizwe because it had concluded that the nonviolence alone would not be sufficient to remove the apartheid regime. Mandela was eventually tried with many of his compatriots at the Rivonia trial, and they were convicted, and they were given life sentences. In fact, the state wanted them to receive the death sentence. But if you haven't heard Mandela's Rivonia trial speech, I strongly encourage you to. Rivonia, Rivonia trials. There's a scratchy audio, and you can search on YouTube Rivonia trials. I think it's posted on the website of the Guardian publication. It's remarkable. It says so much about the man. There's one point, and I think it was because of his honesty, and I've discussed this in the past, and that's why he was spared execution. When he admitted that, yes, he had concluded that armed resistance was the only way to fight the system. And he said, but he did not make that decision lightly. He read up on all the great theorists, war theorists, before he made that decision. And he had determined that they would only hit against state targets, not civilians. But then he gave the justification for fighting the system: the inequity, the humiliation, the exploitation. He had all the numbers for young South Africans dying prematurely at a certain age because of malnutrition, because of lack of health care. It's a remarkable